I was sitting in my cardiologist's office for a routine checkup when a photo on his desk caught my eye. The woman in the picture was wearing a red dress, smiling at the camera, and she was my wife. I forced myself to stay calm. When the doctor walked in, I pointed at the frame and casually asked, "Who's that?" His entire face lit up. "My fiancée," he said proudly. "We're getting married this November." My heart nearly stopped, because my wife had left home less than an hour earlier, after kissing me goodbye. If you found your way here today, I'm more grateful than you know. Tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you joining from? Let's see how far this story travels. Please note, some elements of this story are fictional, crafted to entertain and to teach. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is coincidental, but every message woven into it was written with you in mind. I have spent 40 years of my life studying molecules' chemical bonds and the invisible structures that hold the world together. I have published more than 90 peer-reviewed papers, built a company from a single basement laboratory into one of the most respected biotech firms on the East Coast, and stared down the kind of professional failures that would have broken a younger man clean in half. But nothing, not one moment in 4 decades of science prepared me for what I saw sitting on a doctor's desk on a quiet Monday morning, the 3rd of March, 2025. It was just past 9:30 when I walked into Webb Cardiology on the 12th floor of Meridian Medical Center in Boston. The waiting room smelled the way it always did, antiseptic, and faintly of lavender from the small diffuser Marcus kept near the reception window, because he once told me it lowered patient anxiety before difficult conversations. I had been coming here every 6 months for 6 years. The receptionist knew my name without looking at her screen. The chairs were the same soft charcoal gray. The framed print of the Charles River in autumn still hung slightly crooked above the magazine rack, exactly as it had the very first time I walked through that door back in the fall of 2019. I was 68 years old, in good health for my age, and genuinely in a fine mood. 3 weeks earlier, I had completed the most significant research of my career, a synthetic bioactive compound with applications in targeted cancer therapy that I believed could change the way the disease was treated at the molecular level. The formal public announcement was already scheduled for that coming November. Everything for the first time in years felt like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Marcus's assistant, a young woman named Diane who always offered me coffee before I could ask, waved me through to the examination room with a warm smile. "Dr. Webb is just finishing up with another patient, Dr. Foster. He'll be right with you." I settled into the chair beside the examination table and did what I always did while waiting. Let my eyes move around the familiar room. The diplomas from Johns Hopkins and Mass General, the anatomical poster of the human heart with its color-coded chambers, the small bookshelf lined with cardiology journals, a potted succulent on the windowsill that had somehow survived 6 New England winters, and then on the left corner of his desk, next to his monitor, a silver picture frame. I noticed it because the mid-morning light from the window struck the frame at exactly the right angle, catching it like a signal mirror. A reflex made me glance over, and then I stopped glancing and started staring, because the woman in that photograph was wearing a red dress standing in front of a hillside blazing with gold and amber autumn leaves, laughing at whoever was behind the camera, and I knew that laugh. I knew the way her chin tilted up when something genuinely struck her as funny. I knew the small scar at the edge of her left eyebrow from a fall she told me had happened when she was 9 years old. My chest did something I can only describe as a full lurching stop. That was my wife. The door opened, and Marcus Webb walked in, 52 years old, broad-shouldered, carrying his tablet, with the easy confidence that good cardiologists develop after years of delivering news that required patients to trust them immediately. He looked up with the warm professionalism he reserved for people he genuinely liked. "William." He extended his hand and I shook it. My grip was perfectly steady, I was deeply proud of that. Blood pressure readings have looked great this quarter. How's the sleep been? Better, I said. Completely even. Unremarkable. Marcus, the photograph on your desk. I gestured toward the silver frame with what I hoped looked like nothing more than idle curiosity. The woman in the red dress. Who is she? Marcus Webb's entire face transformed. Not in a guilty way, not the way a man looks when something has been exposed. He looked exactly the way a man looks when someone asks about the single best thing that has ever happened to him. His eyes went soft and warm, and a slow, wide smile spread from one side of his face to the other. That's Victoria, he said, reaching over and tilting the frame slightly so we could both see it better. His voice carried that particular tenderness that a grown man reserves for someone he cannot quite believe is real. My fiancée. We got engaged 4 months ago back in November. I keep meaning to mention it to people we're planning the wedding for late this autumn. My fingers closed around the armrest of the chair. Not tightly enough for him to notice. Just firmly enough to give the feeling somewhere to go besides my face. She's beautiful, I said. She really is. Marcus set his tablet down and settled onto his stool, that smile still holding. I know what you're probably thinking. Bachelor cardiologist at 52, completely set in his ways, figured he'd missed the window entirely. And honestly, William, I had. But then I met Victoria at a charity gala in Cambridge last January, and she just completely rearranged everything. He shook his head with a short, disbelieving laugh. You know what I mean. I do, I said. And the terrible thing was, I did. She lost her first husband a few years back. Marcus continued, reaching for his stethoscope with the easy movements of a man who had absolutely no idea he was dismantling another man's world, one sentence at a time. Heart disease, she told me. She doesn't talk about it much, still carries it quietly, the way some people do. But she is extraordinary, William. Warm, sharp, she actually follows half of what I talk about, which puts her ahead of most people I know. He laughed, clean and genuine. The room had tilted 2 degrees to the left. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with cardiology. When did you say the ceremony was? I asked. We're looking at November. Something elegant, not enormous, Victoria's words. He snapped on a glove and reached for the blood pressure cuff. All right, left arm, please. I extended my arm. I breathed the way I had trained myself to breathe in laboratories when experiments went catastrophically wrong, slowly through the nose, releasing through the mouth, giving nothing away through the face. Marcus wrapped the cuff around my arm and pressed the button. The machine hummed. Numbers appeared on the screen. He nodded with professional satisfaction. Perfect, he said. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I intend to, I told him. And I meant it in a way he could not possibly have understood. He moved through the rest of the examination, with his usual thoroughness, heart, sounds, reflex checks, a brief discussion about cholesterol, and the general virtues of sleeping more than 5 hours a night. I answered every question. I made the correct responses. I asked one follow-up about my latest EKG reading that I already knew the answer to, because asking it made me appear like a man focused entirely on his health and absolutely nothing else. When it was over, Marcus walked me to the door and briefly rested his hand on my shoulder. 6 months, he said. And William, tell that research team of yours to let you rest occasionally. Stress does more damage to the heart than most people are willing to admit. I'll pass that along, I said. I walked down the corridor to the elevator bank. I pressed the call button. I watched the floor numbers descend. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, and stood facing the polished steel doors as they slid shut. My own reflection looked back at me, a 68-year-old man in a gray wool coat, upright, composed, completely unreadable. Inside my chest, something had cracked straight down the middle. But I had been a scientist for 40 years. And scientists do not act on a single data point. They go back to the lab. They verify. They build the evidence until it is so complete it cannot be argued with by anyone, including themselves. I straightened my coat. The elevator reached the lobby. I walked out into the cold March morning and went back to work. The drive from Meridian Medical Center back to Foster Tower took 11 minutes that Monday morning. I counted 8 traffic lights along the route the way I used to count ceiling tiles during graduate school oral defenses when I needed to keep the panic from reaching my face. By the time the elevator opened onto the 18th floor just before 11, I had made one decision. I would not react. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was actually reacting to. My executive assistant, Carol, 23 years with the company, a woman who could read my mood through 2 closed doors and a hallway, looked up from her desk as I came through. Carol Simmons had seen me navigate funding crises, board fights, and a hostile acquisition attempt in 2017 that lasted 8 months. She had never once asked for an explanation she suspected I wasn't ready to give. "How was the checkup, Dr. Foster?" "Unremarkable," I said, which was either the most honest or the most dishonest thing I had said all year. "Hold my calls until 2 o'clock. I need to work through some numbers." She nodded once. "Of course." I closed the office door behind me and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window for a moment, looking out over the Boston skyline. It was late morning now, the harbor throwing back the pale winter sun in flat, cold pieces. 32 floors below the city moved with its usual, purposeful indifference, entirely unaware that a man on the 18th floor had just had 8 years of his life pulled out from under him like a tablecloth from a fully set table. I sat at my desk. I opened the top drawer and took out a yellow legal pad and a pen, not a computer, not my phone, nothing with a digital record. Then I wrote 3 lines in the clean, deliberate handwriting of a man trying very hard to think like a scientist and not a husband. How long? Who is she? What does she want? I stared at those 3 questions for a long moment. Then I picked up my personal cell and called Claudia. She answered on the 2nd ring. Her voice was warm, unhurried, the voice of a woman spending a relaxed Monday morning at a pottery class somewhere in Providence, exactly where she'd said she would be. "William, how did the checkup go?" Was Marcus happy with everything? My jaw tightened just slightly. Not in anger, in recognition. She had called him Marcus, not Dr. Webb, not your cardiologist. Marcus. With the easy familiarity of a woman who had been in that office more than once. "Everything looked good," I said. My voice came out smooth as river stone. "He sends his regards. That man works too hard," she said lightly. The kind of line you say about someone you know well enough to have an opinion about. "Are you heading straight back to the office?" "Already back. Quarterly review at 3. Don't forget to eat lunch." A small, fond laugh. "You get so focused, William. You forget you're an actual human being." "I won't forget," I said. "Good." The comfortable pause of a long marriage. "I'll be home by 7. I was thinking lamb chops. You always sleep better after a real dinner." "That sounds wonderful," I said. "I'll see you at 7. I hung up. I set the phone face down on the desk. Then I looked at my 3 questions and pressed the pen to the pad hard enough to leave an indent on the page beneath, and wrote a 4th line. She called him by his first name. I turned to my desktop computer and opened the Foster Biosciences internal administration portal. Not the financial dashboard. Not the project management system. I navigated directly to the network access logs, the system that recorded every login, every file access, every credential use across the entire company, infrastructure time-stamped and archived automatically. I had built this company from a single room. I knew every system in it. I pulled up the access history for account C.Foster, a courtesy login I had personally approved 18 months earlier so that Claudia could access the company's shared calendar and public research summaries when she attended events on my behalf. Donor dinners, ribbon cuttings, the kind of representational functions a founder's spouse was occasionally expected to handle gracefully, which Claudia always did. The log loaded. 43 entries over 14 months. I leaned forward. The early entries were exactly what I would have expected. Calendar system, the public portal, standard access times during business hours. Then starting 8 months ago, the file paths changed. They pointed deeper into the directory structure, into the research subdirectory, into folders that carried restricted access classifications that a courtesy account had absolutely no business reaching. My hands went very still on the keyboard. I scrolled to the final entry. February 12th, 2025. 3 weeks ago on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:47 p.m. While I had been presenting at a department budget meeting 1 floor above. File path research / compound B / synthesis _ series _ final. File size downloaded 847 megabytes. I pushed back slowly from the desk, the exact way you step away from a laboratory bench, when a reaction has produced a result too significant to touch before you've fully processed what it means. 847 megabytes. The complete compound B synthesis series. 11 years of research. The most valuable intellectual property Foster Biosciences had ever produced, downloaded in a single session by a courtesy account that should never have been able to reach it. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Nathan, my son, 39 years old, a corporate attorney in Back Bay, who had been trying to tell me something about Claudia for the better part of 3 years. I had listened to him with the patient, slightly condescending tolerance of a father who believed his adult child was letting old resentments cloud an otherwise good mind. "Dad, you doing okay? You called last night and didn't really say anything." I looked at the message. I looked at the access log. Outside the window, a flock of starlings crossed the pale Boston sky in that drifting, synchronized way that looks effortless from a distance and is up close a constant negotiation between instinct and physics. I typed back, "I'm fine. Are you home tonight?" His reply came in under 40 seconds. "Yes. Is everything all right?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without answering it at all. "I'll come by around 8, I typed. "There's something I need to think through out loud." I set the phone down. I looked at the 4 questions on the legal pad. Then I folded the page in half and in half again and placed it in the inside breast pocket of my jacket, close enough to feel against my chest every time I moved. A soft knock at the door. Carol's voice steady as always. "Dr. Foster, your 2 o'clock confirmed," and Mrs. Foster called the main line. She wanted to know whether you'd prefer the lamb with rosemary or garlic tonight. Something moved through my chest that had no clean scientific name. Something that lived in the narrow space between grief and irony. "Rosemary," I said. "Thank you, Carol." The door clicked shut. I straightened the legal pad, opened the quarterly review file, and began to read. Because that was what a scientist did when the data was still incomplete and the variables were not yet fully mapped. I kept working. I kept my expression neutral. I kept my hands absolutely steady, and I did not move not 1 inch until the evidence was airtight. Nathan's apartment in Back Bay smelled like strong coffee and old law books, the particular combination of a man who worked late and thought even later. It was just past 8 o'clock on that same Monday evening, the 3rd of March, when he opened the door before I had even raised my hand to knock. My son, 39 years old, a corporate attorney with sharp eyes and a sharper instinct for things people were trying not to say, took one look at my face and stepped back to let me in without a single word of greeting. "Dad." His voice was careful the way it got when he was reading a room. "You look like you haven't blinked since this morning." "I've blinked," I said, "occasionally." He almost smiled. "Almost. Sit down, I'll get you coffee." Nathan's living room was exactly what you'd expect from a man who spent his days buried in contracts, clean, organized, every surface clear, except for the things that needed to be there. 2 framed photographs on the bookshelf, one of his mother who had passed when he was 19. One of the two of us at his law school graduation, both of us grinning like we'd gotten away with something. He came back from the kitchen and set a mug in front of me. Then he sat across the table, wrapped both hands around his own cup, and looked at me the way he'd been looking at me for 3 years, like a man waiting for a door to finally open. "Marcus Webb," I said. "My cardiologist." "Do you know who he is?" Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know the name. He showed me a photograph today. A woman he called his fiancée." I picked up the mug but didn't drink from it. Her name, he said, was Victoria. The color shifted in Nathan's face, not dramatically, not the way it would in a movie. Just a quiet draining like the sun going behind a cloud. He set his coffee down slowly. "Dad, her name is Claudia," I said. "She has been my wife for 8 years, and she apparently told this man that she is a widow." Nathan closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, they were glassy with something that looked uncomfortably close to relief, the devastating kind. Comes not from good news, but from finally being believed. His hands, I noticed, were trembling just slightly against the table. "I tried to tell you," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that my son, composed, controlled Nathan never let happen. "Dad, I tried 3 times, 3 separate times in 3 years. I know." The words sat like stones in my mouth. "I know you did. You told me I was being paranoid." He wasn't accusing me, his voice was too tired for accusation. He was just stating facts the way attorneys did when the outcome was already decided. "You told me I needed to give her a fair chance. You said—" He stopped, pressed his fingers against his forehead. "You know what? It doesn't matter what you said. What matters is what I found." He stood up abruptly and walked down the hallway to his home office. I heard a drawer open and close. When he came back, he was carrying a manila folder so thick it had been held together with 2 rubber bands. He set it on the table between us with a sound that felt final. 3 years, he said. "I started keeping records 3 years ago because I knew no one was going to believe me without them." I pulled off the rubber bands and opened the folder. Inside was a meticulous, methodical archive, the work of a lawyer who understood exactly what kind of evidence held up and what kind fell apart. Printed photographs, time-stamped transaction printouts, handwritten timelines cross-referenced with dates I recognized from my own calendar. A list of names I didn't recognize accompanied by question marks. "The top section," Nathan said, leaning forward and pointing with one finger, "is financial. She's been moving small amounts, nothing large enough to trigger automatic flagging, but consistent, regular intervals always from different accounts." My throat felt like I'd swallowed gravel. "How much?" "That I can see, roughly 60,000 over 2.5 years. He paused. "But Dad, I'm a corporate lawyer, not a forensic accountant. I only found what I could access legally. There could be more." I turned to the photograph section. There were 11 of them printed in sharp color. Claudia at restaurants I had never been to. Claudia at a parking garage near Cambridge on a Tuesday afternoon in January of last year, getting into a car I didn't recognize. And then one that stopped my hand mid-page. Claudia at dinner. A candlelit table at an upscale restaurant in Cambridge. Across from her, a man whose profile I recognized with the particular gut-dropping clarity of someone who had been in that man's examination room just 12 hours ago. Marcus Webb. 14 months ago. On the exact evening I had been presenting a keynote address at a biotech conference in London, which Claudia had declined to attend because she said she had a migraine. "That one," Nathan said quietly, watching my face, "is from October of 2023. I had someone photograph it from across the street. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like my son was doing what I should have been doing," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. The back of my eyes burned in a way that I absolutely refused to let go any further. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose and breathed through it. Nathan's chair scraped against the floor. A moment later, his hand landed on my shoulder, firm, steady, the grip of a man who had learned a long time ago that his father didn't need to be handled gently so much as held steady. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I straightened up. The burning behind my eyes retreated. I closed the folder, carefully replaced the rubber bands, with the precision of a man who understood that these pages were now the most important documents in his possession. "I want to know everything," I said. "Not just what she's done. I want to know who she is. I want to know why." I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in longer than I was comfortable admitting. "And I want to do it right. No mistakes, no emotional decisions. We build this the same way I'd build a case in the lab from the evidence out." Nathan held my gaze. Then he nodded once with the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting 3 years to hear exactly those words. "Then we start tomorrow," he said. I picked up my coffee finally. It had gone cold while we talked. I drank it anyway. I did not sleep that Tuesday night. Not really. I lay in the dark beside Claudia in our bedroom at the Beacon Hill house, a room I had designed myself right down to the bookshelves on the east wall and the particular shade of navy on the trim. And I stared at the ceiling while she slept with the easy, untroubled rhythm of a woman who had absolutely nothing on her conscience. Her breathing was slow and even. At one point, just past 2 in the morning, she turned toward me and draped her arm across my chest, the way she had done for 8 years, and I lay there beneath the weight of it and thought, I am sharing a bed with a woman I do not know. By 5:30 on Wednesday morning, the 5th of March, I was already dressed and sitting in my private study at the back of the house, a room Claudia had never shown much interest in, which I had once taken as a sign of respect for my work, and now reconsidered entirely. The rest of the house was dark and quiet. Outside the study window, the first gray light of a Boston winter morning was just beginning to separate the roof lines from the sky. I opened my personal laptop, not my work machine, not anything connected to the Foster Biosciences network, and I started with the joint financial accounts. Being a co-holder on every account in our marriage gave me complete legal access to every transaction, every statement, every transfer going back to the day we opened them. I had simply never looked closely before. I had trusted the quarterly summaries our financial advisor sent. I had trusted the woman sleeping upstairs. I pulled 12 months of statements and started reading from the bottom up. Most of it was ordinary: the mortgage, utilities, the grocery store on Charles Street, the dry cleaner 2 blocks from my office. Then 8 months ago, something changed. A recurring transfer, always on the 14th of each month, always in amounts small enough to feel routine, $1,200. Then $1,500. Then in January 2000. The recipient account was listed only as a routing number. No name attached. My stomach turned over. I opened a new window and navigated to the Foster Biosciences administrative portal. I had accessed the network access logs 2 days ago and found the C.Foster account. Now I needed to go deeper, specifically into the permission history. I needed to know who had elevated that courtesy account's access clearance from the public portal to the restricted research directory. The permission log loaded slowly. When it did, I felt the air leave my lungs. 14 months ago, at 11:22 on a Thursday evening, an administrator-level user had modified the C.Foster account permissions to include read and download access to the entire research division directory, including Compound B. The administrator account that made the change was listed as www.foster.admin. My own credentials. I pushed back from the desk so hard, the chair hit the wall behind me. My hands were shaking now, not violently, but with that fine, involuntary tremor that comes when the body registers something the mind is still trying to refuse. Someone had used my administrator login to give Claudia access to the most sensitive research data in the company. Either my credentials had been stolen, or she had accessed my laptop at home and done it herself on an evening when I was asleep, or distracted, or simply not paying attention. I sat with my hands flat on my thighs and breathed until the tremor stopped. Then I went back to the research logs and did something I had not done on Monday. I opened the actual downloaded files and cross-referenced them against the master database. What I found made the financial transfers feel almost minor by comparison. The data that the C. Foster account had downloaded on February 12th was not simply a copy of the compound B synthesis series. Before the download, someone had accessed the file in edit mode for 47 minutes. 47 minutes in which specific parameters within the synthesis formula had been altered subtly, carefully, in ways that would not be immediately obvious to anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with the original. Reaction temperatures shifted by fractions of a degree. Catalyst ratios adjusted just enough to push the process outside the effective range. The file that had been downloaded and presumably passed along to someone else was not the real formula. It was a convincing forgery of it. A version that would fail in any serious laboratory attempt. Claudia wasn't just stealing my research. She was planning to sell a broken version of it to someone, and when that someone discovered the deception, every finger would point directly at Foster Biosciences. At me. I heard the bedroom door open upstairs. Footsteps on the hallway floor. Then Claudia's voice, warm and morning soft, calling down toward the study. "William, you're up early. Do you want coffee?" I closed the laptop lid. I rolled my shoulders back. I arranged my face into something that resembled a man who had simply woken early and gotten a head start on emails. "That would be great," I called back. "Thank you." I listened to her move into the kitchen, the familiar sounds of cabinets opening the coffee grinder, running water filling the kettle. Every sound perfectly ordinary. Every sound now a performance I could no longer unhear. I reached for my phone and sent Nathan a text, "Found more. Worse than the folder. Call me at noon, not from your office phone." His reply came 4 minutes later. "Understood. And Dad, are you okay?" I looked at the closed laptop. I thought about 47 minutes of deliberate sabotage. I thought about $1,200 a month flowing somewhere I couldn't trace. I thought about my own credentials used against me in my own house. Working on it, I typed back. I pocketed the phone, stood up, and walked toward the kitchen to have coffee with my wife. I called Rebecca Harmon from my car on Thursday afternoon, the 6th of March, while sitting in the parking structure 2 blocks from Meridian Medical Center with the engine still running. Rebecca had been Foster Biosciences' head of legal for 11 years, a Harvard law graduate who had joined us as a junior associate at 23 and built herself case by careful case into the sharpest legal mind in the building. She was 34 now, precise in the way that only people who genuinely love the law become precise, and she had the rare gift of being completely unshockable without being cold about it. "Rebecca," I said when she picked up, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer as my attorney, not as my employee." A beat of silence, then, "Of course, go ahead." If I walk into Meridian Medical Center right now and request my complete patient file, every document, every assessment, every note ever recorded under my name, is there anything that could prevent them from giving it to me? I could hear her clicking her pen on the other end, which she only did when she was thinking fascist. Under HIPAA, any patient has the unconditional right to access their own medical records within 30 days of request. In Massachusetts, most facilities provide them same day for straightforward requests. They cannot deny you. They cannot redact without written justification. She paused. "William, why are you asking me this?" "Because Nathan told me something last night," I said, "about a phone call he received 6 months ago from a hospital administrator. He didn't tell me at the time because he had no proof." I stopped, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. "I think someone may have added things to my file. Things I didn't authorize and don't know about." The clicking stopped. Rebecca's voice dropped half a register. "Don't ask for anything specific when you go in. Just request the complete file. Don't show surprise at anything you read while you're still in the building. Copy everything. Call me the moment you're back in your car." "Understood," I said. "And William, if what you're describing is what I think it might be, do not confront anyone in that building today. Not a single person." "I won't," I said. "Thank you, Rebecca." I killed the engine and walked the 2 blocks to Meridian in the cold March afternoon, hands in my coat pockets, moving at the unhurried pace of a man with a routine appointment, rather than a man whose heart was hammering against his sternum with every step. The records department was on the 3rd floor. A young administrator named Greg, cheerful, efficient, completely unsuspecting, pulled up my file on his terminal and smiled. "Dr. Foster, you've been a patient here since 2019. That's going to be a fairly thick packet. Do you want digital printed or both?" "Both, please," I said pleasantly. "I like to be thorough." Greg laughed like I'd made a small joke. He printed and compiled while I stood at the counter and looked at the framed motivational poster above his workstation. Something about perseverance and mountain climbing, and kept my face absolutely composed. When he handed over the envelope, it was heavier than I expected. I thanked him, tucked it under my arm, and took the stairs back down rather than wait for the elevator, because I needed the movement to keep from tearing it open right there in the hallway. I made it to a bench in the small courtyard outside the building. The March air was raw and sharp. My fingers were already working at the envelope clasp. The first 30 pages were what I expected. EKGs, blood panels, blood pressure records, the unremarkable annual notes of a 68-year-old man who exercised regularly, ate reasonably well, and took his medication. I turned pages steadily, breathing through my nose until I reached a section behind a blue divider tab that I had never seen before. Cognitive Capacity Evaluation Series, October through December 2024. 3 separate assessments, 10 pages each. Detailed, clinical, formatted exactly the way legitimate neuropsychological evaluations were formatted, because whoever had produced them understood the system well enough to replicate its language precisely. I read every word. My eyes moved across phrases like progressive memory lapses and diminished executive function, and early indicators consistent with mild cognitive decline. And I felt something cold and specific travel from the base of my skull straight down to my feet, not shock exactly, but the particular nausea of a man recognizing the shape of a trap he has been standing inside without knowing it. I had never attended a single one of these evaluations. Not in October, not in November, not in December. On the dates listed in this file, I had been in my laboratory and board meetings at my desk. I had been by every verifiable measure entirely myself. But on paper in this building, I had been quietly losing my mind for 3 months. I turned to the final pages of the packet. Behind the evaluations was a partially completed legal form, the kind that required typed entries in specific fields and carried a court filing designation at the top right corner. Petition for legal guardianship, Commonwealth of Massachusetts Probate and Family Court. The petitioner field had been filled in. The name typed there in clean 12-point font was Claudia M. Foster. The section for the proposed ward. The person to be placed under guardianship listed William Arthur Foster, D.O.B., March 14, 1957. My own name, my own birth date, formatted as though I were already incapable of managing my own affairs. The form was incomplete. It was missing the signature of a second evaluating physician and the court docket stamp that would indicate it had been filed. But the structure was there. The foundation was laid. Someone had been building toward this for months, and they had been doing it inside a medical institution I had trusted with my health for 6 years. My hands were shaking so badly by this point that the pages rattled against each other. I pressed them flat on my knees and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, until the shaking stopped. Then I took out my phone and called Rebecca. She picked up before the second ring. "Tell me," They built a file, I said. My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. 3 months of cognitive assessments that I never took signed by physicians I've never met. And there's a partially filed guardianship petition. My wife is listed as the proposed guardian. I heard Rebecca draw a sharp breath that she tried to suppress. The form is incomplete. It needs a second physician's signature and a court filing, which means it's still in preparation, Rebecca said tightly. William listened to me carefully. Make copies of every single page before you leave that building. Keep the originals on your person. Do not put them anywhere in the house. Already ahead of you, I said. Good. A pause. I could hear her thinking through the phone, fast, sharp, building the legal architecture in real time. I'll see you tomorrow morning. 6:30 my office. Bring everything. We have a great deal of work to do. I folded the documents back into the envelope and stood up from the bench. My legs felt steadier than they had any right to. Above me, the gray Boston sky pressed down over the rooftops, indifferent and enormous. Someone had spent months constructing a version of me on paper, a diminished, incapable version, and they had done it with such patience and precision that it had nearly gone completely unnoticed. I walked back to my car and drove home to have dinner with my wife. At 6:28 on Friday morning, the 7th of March, I stepped out of the elevator onto the 15th floor of Foster Tower, while the rest of the building was still dark, and the cleaning crew was finishing the overnight rounds. Rebecca Harmon was already at her desk when I knocked on the open glass door of her office jacket. On coffee in hand, 2 additional monitors pulled forward, the particular focused energy of a woman who had been here since before 5. Close the door, she said without looking up from her screen. I closed it. I sat in the chair across from her desk and placed the envelope from Meridian Medical Center between us. She pulled it toward her, opened it, and began reading with the concentrated stillness of someone who understood that every word on every page was potential ammunition. For 4 minutes, neither of us spoke. Rebecca's expression did not change. But I watched her jaw tighten twice, once at the cognitive evaluation summary, and once sharply when she reached the guardianship petition. All right, she said, finally setting the papers down with controlled precision. Tell me everything else, from the beginning. Don't edit. So I did. I told her about the photograph on Marcus Webb's desk, about the access logs and the 847 megabytes, about Nathan's folder and the 3 years of documentation he had compiled alone, about the financial transfers and the altered research data. I laid it out in sequence the way I would present findings at a conference, chronologically, factually, without embellishment. Rebecca listened without interrupting once. She made notes in a legal pad in her small, precise handwriting. When I finished, she set her pen down, picked up her coffee, and looked at me over the rim of the cup with the expression of someone who has just been handed a case that is simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. The guardianship play is the center of it, she said. Everything else, the financial transfers, the research data, those are secondary. The primary objective is control. If she obtains legal guardianship over you before November, she controls your assets, your medical decisions, and most critically, your ownership stake in this company. She leaned forward. 72% of Foster Biosciences, William. That's what she's after. My throat tightened. How close is she? Close enough that we cannot waste a single day. Rebecca turned to her left monitor and began typing. I'm going to start with a full background verification. Name, Social Security number, academic credentials, address, history, prior employment. Everything she submitted when you married, every document that established who she claims to be. You think the identity itself is false, I said. Rebecca looked at me steadily. I think we need to verify that it isn't. There's a difference. She held my gaze a moment. But yes, I think it's possible. She typed for several minutes while I sat with my coffee and watched the early morning light begin to touch the tops of the downtown buildings through her office window. At 7:15, she picked up her desk phone and dialed a number from memory. Yes, good morning. This is Rebecca Harmon. I'm General Counsel for Foster Biosciences in Boston. I'm trying to verify the academic credentials of a former student. The name on file is Claudia Ann Mercer, listed graduation year 2001 undergraduate program, School of Literature, Science, and the Arts. She listened. Yes, I'll hold. She held for 3 minutes. I watched her face. It gave nothing away until the person on the other end came back, and then almost imperceptibly, her eyes sharpened. I see, she said. And there's no record of a transfer or a name change attached to that student ID. She listened again. No, that's fine. Thank you for your time. She placed the receiver down with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something fragile. The University of Michigan has no record of a student named Claudia Ann Mercer graduating in 2001, she said. They searched all variants of the name and the student ID number on the credential. Nothing. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. I felt the impact move through my chest in slow, expanding rings. The diploma on file in our HR system, I said, is a fabrication, Rebecca said flatly. She was already back on her keyboard. I'm now running the passport number through a federal verification service we use for international contract work. It takes about 10 minutes. While we waited, she cross-referenced the Social Security number against the public records database. The number existed. It was assigned. But the assignment date was recent, issued just 14 months before Claudia and I met, to an address in Detroit, that when Rebecca pulled satellite imagery had been a vacant lot since 2018. Someone built this identity from scratch, Rebecca said almost to herself, her eyes scanning the screen. New SSN, new academic records, new address history. This is not an amateur job. This took resources and time and someone who understood institutional documentation systems. She looked up at me. William, whoever this woman is, she did not become Claudia Mercer last year. She has been Claudia Mercer for at least a decade, possibly longer. This was prepared well in advance of meeting you. The passport verification came back. Number issued 9 years ago. The registered address, an apartment building in downtown Detroit, had been demolished in 2019. The building, according to city records, had contained 14 units. None of the former tenants matched the name Claudia Mercer. Rebecca printed everything, stacked the pages with her habitual neatness, and placed them beside the medical file. Then she looked at me across the desk with the direct, unflinching gaze of a woman who understood that what she said next was going to hit harder than everything that had come before. Do you want to know her real name? She asked. My hands were completely still on the armrests of the chair. My chest felt like something inside it had been wrung out slowly and put back wrong. 8 years. 8 years of dinners and anniversaries, and the particular intimacy of a long marriage, and every single moment of it had been constructed by a woman whose actual name I did not know. Not yet, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended, rougher at the edges. First, I need to understand why. The name can wait. I met Rebecca's eyes. The reason cannot. Rebecca held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, once reached for her legal pad and started writing. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, that the reason, when we finally found it, was going to be worse than any name. I called Marcus Webb on Saturday morning, the 8th of March, from a burner phone I had purchased the day before at a convenience store on Commonwealth Avenue, a precaution that would have felt paranoid to me 1 week ago and felt entirely reasonable now. I kept the call short and used a tone I had spent 40 years perfecting in faculty meetings and boardrooms, the tone of a man who is mildly concerned rather than urgently afraid. Marcus, it's William Foster. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. William. A note of genuine warmth, entirely unsuspecting. Not at all. What can I do for you? I'd like to buy you a coffee this afternoon if you have an hour. Not a medical thing, just something I'd like to think through with someone I trust. I paused the right amount of time. You've been my doctor for 6 years. I'd value your perspective. A beat. Of course. Is everything all right? I think so, I said. I just want to be sure. We met at 2 o'clock at a small coffee shop near Fenway Park. The kind of place with mismatched wooden chairs and a chalkboard menu, and enough ambient noise from the Saturday afternoon crowd that a quiet conversation at a corner table would go completely unheard by anyone 3 feet away. Marcus was already there when I arrived in a weekend jacket and no tie, holding a black coffee, and looking like a man who had set aside a pleasant Saturday afternoon, out of nothing but goodwill, toward a patient he'd known for years. He stood when he saw me and extended his hand with that easy, open smile. "William, you look well." "Thank you for coming," I said. I sat down across from him and placed my leather document folder on the table between us, but did not open it yet. I ordered a coffee I did not intend to drink, and then I asked the question I had been holding since Saturday morning. "Marcus, how much did Victoria tell you about her life before she met you?" Something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not yet, just the slight recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of conversation. "Quite a bit, actually. She's very open." "Why? Did she tell you about her first husband?" "She did." His voice gentled the way it did when he was discussing something delicate. "She told me he passed away from heart disease about 7 years ago. She said it was a very difficult time for her." He tilted his head slightly. "William, where is this going?" I opened the document folder. I took out the first item, a certified copy of a marriage certificate issued by the Cook County Clerk's Office in Chicago, Illinois, dated September 14th, 2016, and placed it on the table in front of him. Marcus looked down at it. I watched his eyes move across the names, the date, the official seal. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "The man listed as the groom," I said, "is me." Marcus set his cup down with a small, careful click. His face had gone the color of old paper. "William, the woman listed as the bride." I continued, keeping my voice level and unhurried. "Is the woman you introduced to me on Monday as your fiancée." I placed a second document beside the first, a photograph. The two of us at our 5th anniversary dinner taken by the restaurant manager at our request. Claudia in a blue dress, laughing, her hand in mine. Her name, as far as I have ever known, is Claudia, and as of this past Monday morning, she is still my wife. Marcus Webb was not a man who fell apart easily. 30 years of cardiology had built a particular architecture of composure into him, the kind you needed when you were delivering terminal diagnoses to families who weren't ready to hear them. But watching him sit across that table from me, I saw that architecture crack straight across the middle. His jaw went tight. His eyes went glassy. He pressed his fist against his mouth and breathed through his nose with the concentrated effort of a man fighting to keep himself together in a public place. "She told me..." His voice broke. He stopped. Tried again. "She told me his name was Richard, that he died of a cardiac event." A short, pained sound escaped him that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "I'm a cardiologist, William. She told a cardiologist that her husband died of a heart attack." "I know," I said, and I meant it with every ounce of the particular grinding sympathy one deceived person can feel for another. "Marcus, I need you to look at one more thing." I took out the photocopies from the Meridian Medical Center file, the cognitive capacity evaluations, the partially completed guardianship petition, and laid them across the table. Marcus pulled them toward him. His hands were trembling now, visibly, the fine, unsteady tremor of a man whose world had just been restructured without his permission. He read the first evaluation page, then the second. When he reached the signature block at the bottom of the third assessment, he went completely rigid. "That's my signature," he said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "William, that is my signature on a document I have never seen before in my life." "I know," I said. "Someone forged—" He stopped, pressed both palms flat on the table as if he needed the physical grounding. His eyes were burning now, red at the rims, the look of a man trying furiously not to cry in a coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. "This is a felony. Forging a physician's signature on a medical evaluation for a legal proceeding, that is a federal crime." "Yes," I said, "it is." Marcus looked up at me across the scattered documents, and for a long moment, the noise of the coffee shop, the espresso machine, the Saturday chatter, the scraping of chairs felt very far away. The grief on his face was raw and unguarded, the kind that comes not just from being lied to, but from understanding fully and suddenly just how completely you believed the lie. "4 years," he said, and his voice cracked on the number. "I have known her for 4 years, William. I was going to marry her." "I know," I said for the third time, because there was nothing else to say that would not make it worse. Marcus pulled in a long, shaking breath. He straightened his spine. He gathered the documents into a neat stack with hands that were still not entirely steady, and looked at me with the eyes of a man who had just decided something. "What do you need from me?" he asked. I picked up my coffee for the first time. "Not yet," I said. "But when the time comes, I'll need everything. Your testimony, your records, your cooperation with whatever legal process follows." I held his gaze. "And I need you to give no indication to her that anything has changed." Marcus nodded slowly. The grief was still there, carved deep, but beneath it something harder had taken shape, the particular resolve of a man who understood. He had been used and had decided with complete clarity what came next. "You have it," he said. "All of it." The 48 hours that followed my meeting with Marcus Webb were the longest of my life, and I say that as a man who once spent 3 consecutive days awake in a laboratory, waiting for a chemical reaction that kept refusing to complete. I drove home from Fenway on that Saturday evening, the 8th of March, parked in the garage beneath the Beacon Hill house, and sat in the car for 4 full minutes before going inside. I needed those 4 minutes. I used them to take apart every emotion I was carrying: the grief, the controlled fury, the ache of watching Marcus Webb's face fall apart across that coffee shop table, and fold each one away carefully, the way you secure volatile compounds before entering a space where a single spark could cause irreversible damage. Then I walked through the door and called out, "Claudia, I'm home." She appeared from the kitchen doorway, wearing an apron, holding a wooden spoon, her hair pulled back in the loose way she wore it on weekends. She looked as she always looked, like exactly what she had spent 8 years convincing me she was. "Perfect timing," she said, smiling warmly. "Pasta's almost ready. How was your afternoon?" "Good," I said, hanging up my coat. "Ran some errands, stopped for coffee. You and your coffee." She disappeared back into the kitchen. "Go wash up, 15 minutes. I went upstairs. I washed my hands. I looked at my own face in the bathroom mirror for a moment. 68 years old, a man who had spent a week learning that his entire domestic life was a stage production, and I made myself a promise. Not of revenge, not of anger, just of discipline. I would not move a single piece until the board was completely set. Dinner was by any external measure a pleasant evening. Claudia made linguine with clam sauce. She had learned the recipe, she once told me, from her grandmother in Vermont. I wondered now whether there had ever been a grandmother in Vermont. She poured us each a glass of white wine. We talked about an article she had read about coastal erosion and a museum exhibition she wanted to visit in April. And then somewhere between the pasta and the second glass of wine, she asked, "Has the team finalized the venue for the November announcement yet?" I looked at her across the candlelight. Nothing on her face but pleasant curiosity. "Still deciding between 2 options," I said easily. Probably the Fairmont Copley. Better acoustics for a large presentation. The Fairmont is beautiful, she said. She did not write it down. She did not reach for her phone. She just nodded and took a sip of wine and steered the conversation somewhere else entirely. But I had watched her eyes when I said it, that single precise flicker of attention there, and gone in under a second, the way a camera shutter opens and closes so fast you almost don't see it. She had logged the information, filed it away behind that warm, untroubled smile. I slept or pretended to by 10 o'clock. At 12 minutes past 2 in the morning on Sunday, the 9th of March, I felt the mattress shift beside me. I kept my breathing slow and even, the breathing of a deeply sleeping man. Through barely open eyes, I watched Claudia sit up, reach for her phone on the nightstand, and swing her legs silently over the side of the bed. She padded to the window in bare feet, her back to me, her shoulders curved slightly inward over the glowing screen. Her thumbs moved rapidly, a message then another. Then she stood reading whatever came back, and I saw from across the dark room her shoulders drop just slightly, not in relief, but in the focused, private satisfaction of someone who has received confirmation of something important. She came back to bed at 2:26. I know the exact time because I had been watching the nightstand clock with the fixed attention of a man who understood that every detail was now evidence. The next morning, Monday, the 10th of March, I waited until Claudia left for what she said was a gallery opening in the South End. The moment her car left the driveway, I went to her study on the second floor. I did not go through her drawers. I did not touch her computer. I had promised myself I would not do anything that could be characterized as illegal search because I needed every advantage I had to remain clean. But her study desk was not locked, and the notebook lying open on the surface, a slim, leather-covered thing she used for what she called her personal scheduling, was visible from the doorway without me needing to enter the room or touch a single thing. 2 lines written in her precise, elegant hand on the page that lay open. T. Waverly confirmed meeting mid-October. 80 million pending final documentation. I stood in the doorway with my hand on the frame and felt the cold, specific clarity of a man who has just found the last piece of a puzzle he hoped would never be complete. Thomas Waverly, $80 million, pending final documentation. I took out my phone, typed the name, and walked back downstairs. I did not know who Thomas Waverly was yet, but $80 million was not a number that appeared in a private notebook by accident, and mid-October was not a casual deadline. Somewhere beyond the walls of this house, a third person had been drawn into whatever this was, and they almost certainly had no idea what they were walking toward. Before I reveal what was hiding inside that contract, an $80 million deal with my name nowhere on it, drop a 9 in the comments, so I know you're still with me. Every number tells me you're here, and that means everything. And a quick reminder, the story ahead contains some fictional elements built for reflection and storytelling. If that's not for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. Rebecca was already on her second coffee when I walked into her office on Tuesday morning, the 11th of March at 7:45. Nathan was there too. He had driven in from Back Bay before sunrise, still wearing his overcoat, a legal pad already open on his knee. The 3 of us had never sat in this room together before, not like this, not with the door closed and the blinds drawn, and the particular charged quiet of people who understood that what they said in the next hour would determine the shape of everything that followed. I gave Rebecca the name first. Thomas Waverly, and a number $80 million. She typed without asking me to repeat it. Nathan looked up from his legal pad with his pen hovering. "Where did you get this?" Nathan asked. "Her study. Monday morning." A notebook open on the desk. 2 lines. I sat down across from Rebecca and watched her screen. Mid-October meeting confirmed. 80 million pending final documentation. Nathan let out a breath through his teeth, a sharp, controlled sound that from my son meant the same thing a slammed door would mean from anyone else. She's moving faster than we thought. She's always been moving faster than we thought, I said. We just didn't know the race had started. Rebecca pulled up a search and began working with the focused, rapid efficiency that had made her indispensable to this company for over a decade. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, the way a surgeon's moved across an instrument tray, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Thomas Waverly, she said, reading aloud as she went. 64 years old, founder and managing partner of Waverly Capital Group headquartered in Manhattan. 30 years in biotech and pharmaceutical investment. Notable exits include 3 FDA-approved drug platforms and 2 major acquisition deals. She paused. His due diligence process is legendary in the industry, William. He's turned down billion-dollar opportunities over documentation irregularities. He is not a man who gets fooled easily. And yet, Nathan said flatly, and yet. Rebecca agreed. She navigated to the Massachusetts Secretary of State's Business Registry, a public database where all registered business entities in the state could be searched by anyone. She typed in a search, waited 4 seconds. Then her jaw tightened in the precise way it did when she found something she had hoped she wouldn't. Mercer Foster Holdings, LLC, she said. Registered in Massachusetts 8 months ago. Single registered member and manager. She turned her monitor so I could read the screen directly. Claudia M. Foster. The name sat on that screen like a stone through a window. Nathan stood up from his chair, not dramatically, just the involuntary movement of a man whose body needed somewhere to put the anger his face wasn't showing. He walked to the window, gripped the frame with one hand, and looked out over the Boston skyline without speaking. She used my name, I said. My voice came out very quiet. She used your name, Rebecca confirmed. Mercer Foster. It implies an authorized partnership. To anyone looking at this from the outside, to Waverly, to any investor, it reads as a legitimate entity connected to you and to Foster Biosciences. She pulled up another screen. I'm pulling the operating agreement. The document loaded. 47 pages of dense legal language establishing the structure, purpose, and authority of Mercer Foster Holdings LLC. Rebecca scrolled while I read over her shoulder, and Nathan came back to the desk, his hand still tense at his side. The stated purpose of the LLC was the licensing and commercialization of a proprietary bioactive compound, described in language that matched almost word for word the internal summary documents from Foster Biosciences' research division. The managing member was identified as Claudia M. Foster, described as co-owner and managing director of the underlying intellectual property. Rebecca reached the signature page of the attached investment term sheet. The intended counterparty was listed as Waverly Capital Group. The agreed investment amount, $80 million. The closing date, November 15, 2025. I had scheduled the public announcement of my compound for November 14th. Nathan caught it the same second I did. He put both hands flat on the edge of Rebecca's desk and leaned forward, his voice dropping to something barely above a murmur. She's planning to sign the deal the day after your announcement. When the compound is public, when the valuation is at its peak, when Waverly has maximum confidence in the asset, and when any questions about ownership could be explained away as a dispute to be resolved later. Rebecca added, her voice clipped and tight with professional fury. By which point she will have $80 million in legal documentation that she was the managing party in the transaction. I looked at the closing date one more time. November 15th. I thought about Claudia asking about the Fairmont Copley Plaza over dinner, the quick camera shutter blink of her eyes when I confirmed the venue. She had not been making small talk. She had been confirming her timeline. Does Waverly know I exist? I asked. Rebecca scrolled to the beginning of the document and ran her eyes across the parties section. Then she scrolled through the recitals, the representations, the disclosure schedules. 47 pages. She looked up at me. Your name does not appear once in this document, she said. Not once. The room felt very still for a moment. Nathan straightened up and ran one hand through his hair, the gesture he had made since he was a teenager when something hit him harder than he expected. His eyes were bright, with the kind of anger that lived just behind controlled composure, pressing forward, looking for the seam. "So Waverly is walking into an $80 million transaction," he said, "believing he is buying a license from the legitimate owner of a compound that she does not own, has no right to sell, and has handed him a falsified version of." "Yes," I said. Nathan made a sound low in his chest that was not quite a word. Rebecca pressed her fingers against her temple and looked at the screen with the expression of someone doing very precise arithmetic on very unpleasant numbers. "He's a victim," she said. "An unwitting one, but a victim nonetheless. Which means we have an obligation, legal and ethical, to reach him before November 15th. She looked at me directly. "But we cannot move too early. If Claudia gets any indication that we're building a case, she will move the assets, destroy the documentation, and disappear before we have enough to hold her." "How long do we need?" I asked. "At minimum 3 weeks to build an airtight file." Rebecca picked up her pen and began writing in her precise small hand. "I want financial forensics on the LLC accounts, a full authentication analysis of the forged medical documents, and a formal legal opinion on the intellectual property ownership question before we approach Waverly or anyone else." Nathan nodded. He had calmed himself down to the focused, methodical energy of the attorney. He was the version of my son that had learned to turn anger into precision. "I'll start the IP documentation chain today. We need to establish an unbroken record of William's sole ownership from the first research notes to the current compound." "Good," I said. I looked at both of them, my son and the woman who had been protecting this company's legal interests for 11 years, and felt something move through my chest that was not grief and not rage, but something older and quieter. Gratitude, maybe. The particular kind that comes when you realize you are not standing alone in the dark. 2 weeks, I said. Then we take it apart. There are 2 places in the world where I think with complete clarity. One is my study at home. The other is the basement laboratory at Foster Tower, the original lab built with my own hands in 2003, where the first notes on Compound B were scratched onto a legal pad, long before anyone believed it would amount to anything. On Wednesday evening, the 12th of March, I rode the elevator down to the basement just after 9 o'clock. I had been working through the data comparison for nearly 2 hours when I found it the thing that shifted everything from theft into something with a much uglier name. I picked up my phone and called Nathan. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert in the way it got when he was running on adrenaline rather than sleep. "Dad, what's wrong?" "I need you and Rebecca here," I said. "Now. Not tomorrow morning. Now. Bring her if she'll come. A beat. We'll be there in 30 minutes. They arrived at 9:52, Nathan still in his work clothes from the day, Rebecca, in a dark coat over what was clearly a hastily grabbed sweater, her hair down instead of pinned, a leather notebook already in her hand. I met them at the basement elevator and walked them back through the lab without preamble. Rebecca looked around at the steel benchtops, the equipment, the whiteboard covered in notation, with the quiet attentiveness of someone cataloging an unfamiliar environment. "I've never been down here before," she said. "Nobody comes down here unless I invite them," I said. "That's the point." I pulled up the comparison analysis on the encrypted laptop and turned the screen so they could both read it. Nathan leaned in first, his eyes moving quickly across the columns of numbers. Rebecca came around to the other side and studied the data with the focused attention that she gave legal documents, parsing every line before moving to the next. Nathan was the first to speak. "Walk me through it. In plain language. The file Claudia downloaded on February 12th is not a copy of my research," I said. I pulled up the whiteboard notation and pointed with a marker. "It looks like a copy. The file name is identical, The structure is identical, the volume of data is almost identical, but the core synthesis parameters have been altered. Reaction temperatures shifted by fractions of a degree. Catalyst ratios adjusted in the binding stages. I tapped the board. If anyone attempts to synthesize a compound using this version of the data, the reaction will appear to proceed correctly. Initial spectroscopic analysis will look clean, but the molecular structure will be incomplete. In any biological efficacy test, any serious clinical trial, it will fail completely. Nathan straightened up. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp with the particular anger of a man connecting dots faster than he wanted to. She's planning to sell Waverly a dud. A very convincing dud, I said. One that costs $80 million to discover. Rebecca's pen was moving rapidly across her notebook. And when it fails, she said without looking up, the paper trail leads directly to Mercer Foster Holdings, LLC, which bears your name, and which will have just executed an $80 million transaction representing this compound as a verified commercially viable asset. She looked up at me, then her eyes very direct. William, that is securities fraud and wire fraud under federal statute. The moment Waverly's team documents the failure and traces it back to the sale, every investigator in that room will be looking for the name behind the LLC, your name. I know, I said. This is not just theft. Nathan said, his voice dropping to something low and precise. She is not trying to take your money and disappear. She is trying to burn your reputation down to the foundation and watch it happen from a safe distance with $80 million in her pocket. He pressed his knuckles against the bench. Dad, who does something like this, who spends years building toward this specific outcome. That question landed in the room and stayed there hanging in the cool basement air. I looked at my son, at the fury and the grief fighting each other behind his eyes, and I felt my own chest tighten with the weight of an answer I didn't yet fully have. Someone who wants more than money, I said quietly. Someone who needs me destroyed publicly, not just financially publicly. In front of the scientific community, in front of investors, in front of everyone who has ever respected this company. I set the marker down. That kind of hatred doesn't come from nowhere, Nathan. It has a history. And tomorrow I need Rebecca to find it. Rebecca closed her notebook with a soft snap. I've been running the identity search in parallel threads, she said. The name, her real name, I'm close. I'll have something definitive by Friday morning. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white around the pen. What I can tell you right now is that the degree of preparation in this case is extraordinary. The false identity, the medical records, the LLC, the altered data, this is not opportunistic. This was designed years in advance, possibly a decade. Nathan exhaled sharply, a sound that was almost a laugh, but carried nothing like humor. A decade. He looked at me. She married you knowing exactly what she was going to do. The words hit me the way certain experimental results hit, not explosively, but with a slow, settling weight that rearranged everything around it. 8 years. 8 years of dinners and anniversaries and the specific quiet intimacy of a shared life. All of it constructed, all of it aimed at this moment like a lens, focusing light until it burned. My eyes stung. I pressed the back of my hand briefly against my mouth and breathed through it because I was 68 years old, and I had been through enough to know that grief was not something you outran, only something you metabolized slowly over time, in whatever private moments you could find. Dad. Nathan's hand landed on my shoulder firm and steady. We are going to get every piece of this, every single piece. I nodded. I straightened up. I looked at the whiteboard, the logic chain, the sequence, the shape of what had been built against me in the dark, and I made the same decision I had been making every day since the 3rd of March. Keep going. Keep the hands steady. Keep building until the evidence is so complete it cannot be argued with. 3 weeks, I said. Then we move. Rebecca was already reaching for her phone. I'll have the real name by Friday, she said. And William, whatever we find, you need to be ready. Because I suspect the reason is going to hurt more than any of the rest of this. I looked at the original workbench where Compound B had first taken shape 11 years ago. The bench where I had believed genuinely and completely that the most important work of my life was still ahead of me. It still was, just not in the way I had imagined. Rebecca called me at 3:47 on Friday afternoon, the 14th of March, which happened to be my birthday, a fact I had not mentioned to anyone, and which the day had chosen to acknowledge by delivering the worst information of my life. "Come to my office," she said. Her voice was measured the way it got when she was carrying something heavy and needed both hands free. "Nathan's already here." I took the stairs from the 18th floor to the 15th rather than wait for the elevator. When I pushed open Rebecca's office door, Nathan was sitting in the chair across from her desk, with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him, the posture of a man bracing for impact. Rebecca was standing at her window with her back to the room, looking out at the afternoon sky over downtown Boston. She turned when she heard me come in. "Close the door," she said. I closed it. I sat beside Nathan. I looked at the thin folder on Rebecca's desk, thinner than I expected, for the answer to a question this large, and I waited. Rebecca sat down. She opened the folder and placed a single printed page on the desk between us. On it was a photograph, black and white, printed from what looked like an old academic faculty directory. A man in his mid-40s, square jaw, wire-rimmed glasses, the particular look of someone who spent more time thinking than sleeping. "Her real name is Sandra Voss," Rebecca said. "She is 41 years old. She grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan." She touched the photograph with one finger. "This is her father. His name was Gerald Voss." The name landed on me like a hand on the shoulder in a dark room, unexpected, physical, immediate. I stared at the photograph. Gerald Voss. The wire-rimmed glasses. The sharp, restless eyes that I remembered arguing with across a conference table at MIT on a wet October afternoon in 1996. Both of us too stubborn and too caffeinated to concede a single point about polymer bonding structures. "I knew him," I said. My voice came out rough at the edges. Nathan's head turned sharply toward me. "You knew her father. We were at MIT at the same time. Early 90s through 98. I kept my eyes on the photograph. He was brilliant. Difficult, he took disagreement as a personal affront which made collaboration almost impossible. But the mind was extraordinary. I paused. What happened to him? Rebecca turned to the next page. In 1998, Gerald Voss was leading a research project on synthetic compound applications in oncology. He had secured significant private funding, approximately $4 million, and was within months of a major publication. She looked at me steadily. Foster Biosciences published first. 6 weeks before his submission date, your team released findings in the same research area that effectively superseded his work. His funding was withdrawn within the month. His research partnership dissolved. He lost the project, the funding, and his position at the university in the same academic year. The room felt like it had contracted around me. I pressed my thumb and forefinger hard against the bridge of my nose and breathed through the pressure of it. "I didn't steal from him," I said. The words came out tight, defensive, in a way I hadn't intended. We were working independently. We were faster. That happens in science. It is brutal, and it is impersonal, and it destroys careers, but it is not theft. "I know that," Rebecca said gently, but without flinching. "And legally, you are completely protected. There was no misconduct, no misappropriation. You simply published first." She paused. But Gerald Voss did not experience it that way. He spent the last 11 years of his life in financial difficulty, professionally isolated. and by most accounts, deeply bitter. Another pause. He died in 2009. Sandra was 23. Nathan exhaled through his nose a sharp, pained sound. He rubbed his face with both hands, dragging his palms down over his jaw, and when he looked up, his eyes were red at the rims. She was 23 years old when she watched her father die broken, he said. And then she spent the next decade building a fake identity and engineering a way inside your life. His voice cracked on the last word just slightly. Dad. She did not marry you by accident. She researched you, targeted you, and built a persona specifically designed to make you fall in love with her. The pain in my chest at that moment was not like anything I had felt before in this entire ordeal. Not the cold shock of the photograph on Marcus's desk, not the clinical horror of the falsified medical records. This was something rawer and more personal. The grief of understanding that every warm moment I had believed in over 8 years had been a calculated instrument of destruction aimed directly at me. My eyes burned. My throat tightened until swallowing took effort. I looked at the photograph of Gerald Voss, a man I had beaten in a race. Neither of us had known we were running against each other. And I felt the full, crushing weight of what a young woman's grief left to fester for 16 years was capable of becoming. She blames me for his death, I said. Yes, Rebecca said quietly. And she's wrong. Nathan said, his voice fierce, now leaning forward. Dad, listen to me. You did nothing illegal. You did nothing unethical. You cannot be held responsible for the consequences of fair scientific competition. I know, I said. But understanding something legally and feeling it are not the same thing. I picked up the photograph of Gerald Voss and looked at it for a long moment. The wire-rimmed glasses, the sharp eyes, the face of a man who had deserved a better ending than the one he got, regardless of how it came about. He was gifted. He deserved more than what happened to him. My voice dropped to something barely above a murmur. I am sorry I was not the person who found a way to give it to him. Nathan's hand came down on my forearm and gripped it hard. Don't, he said. Don't carry that. She made her choices, Dad. Whatever her father suffered, she chose this. She chose 8 years of deception and fraud and cruelty. That belongs to her, not to you. I set the photograph down. I straightened my back. I looked at my son, at the fierce, protective anger in his eyes, and felt something shift in my chest from grief to something harder and more purposeful. What do we do next? I asked. Rebecca picked up her pen. Now, she said, we build the weapon. Nathan spread the documents across the conference table in his financial district office on Saturday morning, the 15th of March at 9 o'clock sharp, and the first thing I noticed was the way he had arranged them, not randomly, but in a precise left-to-right sequence that told a story any judge or jury could follow without explanation. My son had spent the night building a timeline, and looking at it laid out across that polished mahogany table, I felt the particular chill of seeing something abstract become concrete and urgent. Rebecca arrived 3 minutes after me, set her coffee down without drinking it, and began reading from the left. Walk me through it, I said to Nathan. He stood at the head of the table with a legal pad in hand, and for the next 20 minutes, he broke down what the documents showed with the methodical precision of an attorney presenting to a senior partner. His voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept pressing his thumbnail against the edge of his legal pad when he reached a particularly difficult number. The guardianship petition works on a specific legal timeline in Massachusetts, he said. It cannot be rushed without triggering procedural red flags that would invite scrutiny. Sandra. He paused briefly, recalibrating to the name we had only learned yesterday. Sandra has been following the standard timeline almost exactly, which tells me she either researched this thoroughly or had legal guidance. She's had 10 years to research everything, Rebecca said flatly. Right. Nathan tapped the first document. October through December 2024, the fabricated cognitive evaluations are created and entered into the Meridian Medical Center system. That's the foundation. Without those records, there is no petition. He moved to the second document. January 2025, the guardianship petition is drafted. We know it exists because William found the incomplete form in his medical file. He moved right along the table. The projected filing date based on the completion checklist in the petition draft is April 2025, approximately 3 weeks from now. My stomach dropped. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Nathan confirmed, his eyes meeting mine directly. Once it's filed with the probate and family court, it becomes a matter of public record. Every creditor, every board member, every investor in Foster Biosciences will be able to search it. The filing alone, regardless of outcome, creates a cloud over your capacity to run the company. He moved to the next document. Projected hearing date, July 2025. If the petition is supported by 2 physician evaluations and no counter evidence is presented, the court could grant preliminary guardianship as early as September. Rebecca set down her coffee with a sharp click. Which is 6 weeks before the November announcement, she said. If she holds guardianship over William in September, she controls his decision-making capacity legally. She can claim authority over the intellectual property, authorize the Waverly transaction under the LLC, and by the time any court challenge is mounted, the $80 million has already moved. I looked at the documents spread across Nathan's table, the architecture of 8 years of planning, rendered visible in chronological order, and felt something cold and precise settle in my chest. Not fear. Something more like the focused stillness that came just before a critical experiment, when every variable was in place and the only remaining question was timing. What's the weak point? I asked. Nathan and Rebecca looked at each other. It was Rebecca who answered, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table. The petition requires the signature of William's primary treating physician as one of the 2 medical evaluators. The standard of care in Massachusetts guardianship cases strongly favors the testimony of a patient's long-term doctor. She held my gaze. That physician is Dr. Marcus Webb. The implications landed in the room fully formed. Nathan exhaled slowly. I felt the corners of my mouth tighten, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one I had managed in 2 weeks. She's going to go to Marcus for the signature, I said. She has to, Nathan said. Without his name on the petition, a judge will question why the patient's own cardiologist of 6 years was not consulted. It creates an irregularity that opposing counsel, meaning me, could use to delay or dismiss the petition entirely. He paused. She doesn't know that Marcus knows everything. She thinks he's still completely in love with her, I said. She thinks he's 2 weeks away from marrying her, Rebecca said. Which means she will approach him for that signature with complete confidence. She will not be on guard. The 3 of us stood around Nathan's conference table on that Saturday morning in March, and I could feel the shape of the counterattack beginning to form, not from anger, not from vengeance, but from the same patient, systematic logic that had guided every significant decision of my scientific career. You do not dismantle a complex structure by attacking it at the strongest point. You find the load-bearing element, you remove it cleanly, and you let the rest come down on its own. I need to call Marcus, I said. Not yet, Rebecca said firmly, holding up one hand. If you call him now and she sees any change in his behavior, she will accelerate. We need 2 more weeks to complete the evidence file, the financial forensics, the IP documentation chain, the authentication analysis on the medical records. She looked at both of us in turn. We move when the file is airtight, not 1 day before. Nathan nodded slowly. She's waited 8 years, he said. We can wait 2 more weeks. I looked at the documents on the table one last time. the timeline of a plan that had been running in the dark for nearly a decade, finally visible in the light. 2 weeks, I said. Then we take it apart piece by piece. Rebecca picked up her pen and began writing. Nathan began organizing the documents back into their folder, with the careful hands of a man building a case that needed to hold together in court. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Nathan's conference table, the Boston skyline gleamed in the cold March light, entirely indifferent to the war being quietly assembled 30 floors above the street. We had a timeline. We had a weak point. We had 4 people who knew the truth. What we needed now was the patience to use all 3 at exactly the right moment. The week of March 17th was the most disciplined week of my life. Every morning I drove to Foster Tower, rode the elevator to the 18th floor, sat behind my desk, and ran my company exactly as I had run it for 30 years. I attended budget reviews, signed off on department reports, had lunch with the head of our clinical research team on Wednesday, and talked about nothing except protein folding and quarterly projections. Claudia and I had dinner 3 times that week. I asked about her pottery class. She asked about the upcoming announcement. I answered everything with the easy, unhurried calm of a man who had nothing to hide and no reason to rush. Underneath all of it, 4 people were building something with the patience and precision of watchmakers. Rebecca called me on Monday morning the 17th from her direct line, not the company switchboard, which we had agreed to avoid for anything sensitive. "I filed the expedited patent application this morning," she said, and I could hear the quiet satisfaction in her voice. USPTO Track 1 Prioritized Examination. It puts Foster Biosciences on record as the sole owner of Compound B's synthesis process as of today's date. If Sandra attempts to execute the Waverly transaction after November 14th, she will be doing so against a registered patent held by this company, not by Mercer Foster Holdings, LLC. I exhaled slowly. How long until it's confirmed? 6 to 12 months for full approval. But the filing date is what matters legally. From this morning, the ownership record exists. A pause. She cannot undo that without us knowing. Good, I said. What about Nathan? He's meeting with the FBI Boston field office this afternoon. He's presenting the identity fraud documentation, the forged medical records, and the wire transfer history from the LLC accounts. They won't move immediately. Federal investigations take time, but getting it on record now establishes the timeline. Another pause. William, once the FBI opens a file, Sandra will eventually know. We have a window, and we need to use it cleanly. Understood, I said. I'm writing to Waverly today. The letter to Thomas Waverly took me 4 drafts over 2 hours. I could not say too much, not yet. Not without tipping our hand. But I needed to create a reason for him to agree to a private meeting before November. I settled on the truth in its most partial form, that I was the founder of Foster Biosciences, that I had become aware of certain representations being made about my company's intellectual property, and that I believed a brief conversation before any transaction was finalized would be in his significant interest. I signed it with my name and my title and sent it by registered mail to Waverly Capital Group's Manhattan address. His assistant called back on Thursday afternoon. Mr. Waverly would be available for a private meeting in late October. I confirmed without elaboration and marked the date in my calendar in the same handwriting I used for everything else, unremarkable, unhurried, invisible. That Thursday evening, I met Marcus for coffee near Government Center. A different place than Fenway, a different route, a different table near the back. He looked better than he had the week before. The raw, cracked grief of that Saturday afternoon had settled into something quieter and harder, the look of a man who had decided what he was going to do and was at peace with the cost of it. "I've drafted the affidavit," he said, pushing a sealed envelope across the table. "Everything you asked for. My sworn statement that William Foster demonstrated full cognitive capacity at every examination over 6 years. My clinical analysis of the fabricated assessments, the diagnostic language, the testing protocols, the signatures. It's all there. He pressed his fingers flat on the envelope for a moment before releasing it. I also contacted the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine this week, anonymously, about the forged signatures. I looked at him. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. His jaw was tight, his eyes steady. My name is on those documents, William. My professional reputation is attached to a fraud I had no part in. This is not only about you. He picked up his coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup, and for a moment the grief surfaced again, just briefly, just enough to see. I keep thinking about her, about the woman I thought she was. He shook his head tight and short. 4 years. I was going to marry her. I know, I said. Was any of it real? His voice dropped, scraped raw at the edges. Even one conversation, one evening, was any part of her real? I looked at the man across the table. A good doctor, a decent man, a person who had loved someone who did not exist. And I told him the only honest thing I could. I don't know, Marcus. I asked myself the same question every day for 8 years. I still don't have the answer. He nodded, straightened up, took a long breath. What happens next? We wait a little longer, I said, and then we use everything you've given us at exactly the right moment. Marcus looked at me with the eyes of a man who had lost something he could not get back, but had chosen clearly and deliberately what to do with the loss. I'll be ready, he said, whenever you need me. The meeting request arrived on Monday morning, the 7th of April at 8:23, delivered through Foster Biosciences. Formal board notification system, the same secure channel used for quarterly reviews and major corporate decisions. The subject line read, Special Session Leadership and Capacity Review. It was signed by 3 members of the 7-person board of directors. I read it twice at my desk. Then I forwarded it to Nathan and Rebecca with a single line, it's starting. Nathan called back in 4 minutes, his voice tight and controlled. She's filing the petition this week. She needs the board to act first. If she can get a formal capacity resolution passed before the guardianship petition lands in court, it strengthens her legal position significantly. How much time do we have? The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. A beat. 48 hours notice is the minimum required under the corporate bylaws. She filed it at the absolute earliest permissible moment. She's accelerating, I said. She's scared, Nathan said. Something shifted. Either she found out we've been moving, or she has a deadline she hasn't told anyone about. His voice dropped. Dad, are you ready for this? I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window of my office at the Boston skyline, the same view I had looked at on the morning of March 3rd, when everything had still seemed exactly as it was supposed to be. 6 weeks. 6 weeks since a silver picture frame on a doctor's desk had cracked my world open and shown me what was living underneath it. I've been ready since March 3rd, I said. The boardroom on the 20th floor of Foster Tower seated 22 people around a long, oval table of polished dark wood. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the 8th of April, every seat was filled 7 board members, 3 senior executives, legal counsel, and 2 individuals I did not recognize who turned out to be advisors Sandra had brought with her. She sat at the far end of the table from me, dressed in a charcoal suit I had never seen before. Her hair pulled back with the severe precision of someone who had dressed for a performance. She held a leather portfolio in front of her with both hands, her knuckles just slightly pale against the dark cover. She looked across the table at me, and for one fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, less than a blink, something moved behind her eyes that was not composure. Then it was gone and she was perfectly still again. Board member Richard Calloway, a retired pharmaceutical executive who had been on our board for 11 years, opened the session. We're here pursuant to a request filed under Article 7 of the Foster Biosciences Corporate Charter concerning a formal review of executive leadership capacity. He looked uncomfortable. Richard had known me for over a decade, and the discomfort on his face was the particular kind that came from being asked to do something a man did not believe in. Claudia, Mrs. Foster, has submitted documentation she believes the board should review. Claudia, the floor is yours. Sandra opened her portfolio. Her voice when she spoke was measured and warm. The voice of a woman who loved her husband so much. It was breaking her heart to do this. I had heard that voice across the dinner table for 8 years, and even now, knowing everything I knew, the performance was extraordinary. Thank you, Richard. She looked around the table with an expression of careful, painful concern. I want to begin by saying that everything I'm presenting today comes from a place of deep care for William and for this company he built. She placed a stack of documents in front of her and began passing them around the table. Over the past several months, I have grown increasingly concerned about certain changes in William's behavior and cognitive function. These concerns led me to consult with medical professionals, and what they found. Those documents are fabricated. The voice was mine. Calm, flat, completely certain. Every head at the table turned toward me. Sandra's hands stopped moving. Her eyes came up to mine and held there, and this time the thing that moved behind them was not a fraction of a second. It was visible. It was real. It was the look of a woman who had just heard the one sentence she had spent 8 years engineering her plan to prevent. Dr. Foster, Richard began. I apologize for interrupting Richard. I kept my voice level and my eyes on Sandra. But I want to save this board considerable time. I reached under the table, picked up my own leather document folder, and placed it in front of me. Before we proceed further, I'd like to invite someone in. I stood, walked to the boardroom door, and opened it. Dr. Marcus Webb stepped through. He was dressed in a dark suit, carrying a sealed document envelope, and his face held the particular composed gravity of a physician. Prepared to give testimony he had thought about carefully and would stand behind completely. He looked at Sandra as he entered the room. The color drained from her face so completely and so rapidly that the woman sitting beside her reached out instinctively and touched her arm. Dr. Webb, I said, addressing the board, is my cardiologist of 6 years and the physician whose signature appears on several of the documents Mrs. Foster has just distributed. I gestured to the chair beside mine. He has a statement he would like to make. Marcus sat. He placed the envelope on the table, opened it with steady hands, and looked around the room at faces that were already shifting confusion, giving way to attention, giving way to the particular alertness of people who understood they were about to hear something that would change the shape of the morning entirely. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, he said, and I need to tell this board something about those documents that I believe cannot wait another minute. Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. Foster Biosciences, 18th floor boardroom, then corridor, then parking garage, 10:14 a.m. The boardroom felt like a courtroom by the time Sandra finished speaking. 22 years of building Foster Biosciences, and now I was sitting at my own conference table, while a woman I had called my wife for 8 years laid out fabricated documents in front of 7 board members like she was presenting a quarterly earnings report. I kept my hands flat on the table, steady, deliberate, because if I let them tremble, she would win. The cognitive assessments were conducted over 3 consecutive months. Sandra said, her voice smooth as polished marble. She clicked to the next slide bar graphs, clinical language, official letterheads. Dr. Marcus Webb confirmed the progressive deterioration. The petition before the court reflects a sincere concern for William's capacity to lead this company. Board member Gerald Ashton leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. William, are you aware of these evaluations? I looked him straight in the eye. I've never sat in that examination room, Gerald. Not once. The records clearly state the records are forgeries. I kept my voice level. And I can prove it. Right now. In this room. Sandra's jaw tightened just barely. Just enough for me to catch it. That hairline fracture in her composure. She masked it instantly with a practiced smile. William, I understand this is difficult. Don't. My voice came out harder than I intended. My chest was burning like I'd swallowed hot coals. Don't speak to me like I'm already incompetent. I reached down and pressed the intercom button. Carol, please send Dr. Webb in. The door opened 30 seconds later. Marcus walked in looking like a man who had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment, because he had. His back was straight, his expression composed, but his eyes found Sandra's immediately, and the look that passed between them was electric. She went perfectly still. Dr. Webb? Board Chairman Eleanor Holt spoke carefully. You're named as the evaluating physician in these documents. Marcus set a sealed envelope on the table. I am aware of that. His voice didn't waver. The signature on those documents is mine. The clinical records are not. I never evaluated William Foster for cognitive decline. I never authored those assessments. What you are looking at is a forgery bearing my name without my knowledge or consent. He paused, and his knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. I have filed a sworn affidavit with the Massachusetts Board of Medicine and the FBI Boston Field Office documenting this. You will find a full copy inside that envelope. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Eleanor Holt pressed her palms flat on the table and looked directly at Sandra. Mrs. Foster, Claudia, do you have anything to say? Sandra's eyes moved around the room with the careful calculation of a chess player assessing a board that had just flipped. Then she straightened her posture and said with remarkable composure, I think the board should proceed with all due diligence before drawing conclusions. Nathan stepped forward from the far side of the room. He had been standing near the window the entire time, so still that half the board had forgotten he was there. Chairman Holt, he said, placing a second document on the table. I'm Nathan Foster, corporate counsel, and the company's principal shareholder after my father. This is a verified filing from the FBI regarding identity fraud, wire fraud, and the fraudulent formation of Mercer Foster Holdings, LLC, an entity formed without my father's knowledge or authorization intended to redirect an $80 million investment from Thomas Waverly. He let that number land. He let it breathe. The individual you know as Claudia Mercer Foster has been operating under a fabricated identity for the past 9 years. Her legal name is Sandra Voss. The sound that went through the room wasn't loud. It was the sound of 7 people recalibrating every assumption they had ever made. Sandra stood up. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor. This is a targeted attack on my character. Sit down. Eleanor Holt's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of someone who had run 3 Fortune 500 companies before joining this board. No one is leaving this room until legal counsel reviews these documents. Sandra did not sit down. She grabbed her bag from the back of her chair, and for 1 second, just one, her eyes found mine across the table. I had expected to see rage. What I saw instead was something worse. She looked at me like I was a problem she hadn't finished solving yet. Then she walked out. Rebecca was waiting in the corridor. I learned this later. I didn't see it myself because I was still in the boardroom, while Eleanor Holt moved to emergency session procedures. But Nathan told me afterward that Sandra had taken 12 steps down the hallway before Rebecca fell into pace beside her. Sandra Voss. Rebecca said, not a question. My name is Rebecca Harmon. I'm legal counsel for William Foster. Before you make another move, you should know that your offshore transfer of $2.3 million from the Foster Biosciences discretionary account was flagged this morning. She held up her phone. The screen showed a wire transfer notification time-stamped 9:47 a.m., 17 minutes before the board meeting had even begun. That's federal Ms. Voss. Wire fraud, money laundering, misappropriation of fiduciary assets. The FBI will be at your door by end of day. Sandra stopped walking. She turned slowly. Her face was a mask, but her hands, I noticed later in the security footage Nathan pulled, were pressed hard against her bag strap, knuckles, white fingers rigid. You have no idea what he took from my family, Sandra said. Her voice had dropped low, the practiced elegance stripped away. Underneath it was something raw and old and aching. Rebecca's voice didn't soften. Whatever happened 30 years ago does not give you the right to destroy an innocent man. Sandra said nothing more. She pushed through the stairwell door and was gone. Back inside the boardroom, the vote was unanimous. The board passed a unanimous resolution affirming Dr. Foster's full executive capacity, revoked Sandra's proxy authority, and authorized full cooperation with the FBI investigation. Eleanor Holt shook my hand afterward, and her grip was firm. "William," she said, "I'm sorry we didn't see this sooner." My throat tightened. I managed a nod. That was all I could give her. Nathan was beside me as the room emptied. He put one hand on my shoulder, and that simple weight, my son's hand on my shoulder, nearly undid me. My eyes burned hot. I blinked hard against it. "You okay, Dad?" I exhaled slowly, pressing my fist against the edge of the table just to feel something solid. "I will be," I said. "Ask me again in 6 months." He let out a short, broken sound that might have been a laugh and might have been the beginning of a cry. Then he pulled me into a hug, the kind neither of us had exchanged in years, and I felt his shoulders shake just once before he steadied himself. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston hummed on 30 stories below. None of it knew. None of it cared. The city kept moving, indifferent and relentless. But in that room with my son's arms around me and the weight of 8 years finally beginning to lift, I let myself feel the full measure of it. The betrayal, the grief, the exhaustion, and I thought it isn't over yet. She still has Waverly. She still has tonight. And so did I. Monday, April 7th, 2025. The Langham Hotel, Boston Suite, 4126, 48 p.m. I had chosen the Langham because it was neutral ground. No corporate affiliations, no security cameras that anyone had reason to review, and the kind of quiet that money buys. The hush of thick carpets and heavy curtains and staff trained never to linger. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the armchair facing the door, my hands wrapped around a glass of water I hadn't touched. Thomas Waverly arrived at exactly 6:48. He was younger than I expected from his press profile, mid-50s, sharp jawline, the kind of controlled physical energy that comes from decades of competitive squash and disciplined ambition. He walked in with his jacket over one arm and looked around the suite with the mild, assessing gaze of a man who was never quite off duty. "Dr. Foster." He extended his hand. His grip was firm, direct. "I'll admit your assistant's message was the most unusual request I've received this quarter." I stood and shook his hand. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Waverly. Please sit down." He settled across from me, dropped his jacket over the arm of the chair, and studied me with open curiosity. "Your message said you had information regarding an investment I'm considering. Something about fraud." "Yes." I placed a manila folder on the coffee table between us and left my hand flat on top of it. "Before I open this, I need to ask you something directly. How much do you know about the woman who approached you, the one who called herself Claudia Foster?" Waverly's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The mild curiosity sharpened into attention. "She represented herself as the operating partner of Mercer Foster Holdings. She has authorization documentation bearing your signature." "My signature was forged," I said. "The LLC was formed without my knowledge. I have never authorized the sale of the compound B synthesis patent to any party." The quiet that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt enormous. Waverly's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and when he spoke again, the civility in his voice had stripped down to something harder underneath. Dr. Foster, I have $80 million staged for a contract closing on November 15th. I know. I opened the folder. And I need you to understand what you would have received in exchange for that $80 million. I walked him through it methodically, the way I used to walk junior researchers through a failing experiment. Not with emotion, with evidence. The access logs showing the data theft. The laboratory analysis showing the altered synthesis parameters. Temperature deviations of 0.3 to 0.7 degrees Celsius catalyst ratios shifted just enough to render the compound biologically inert. The side-by-side comparison of the real compound B formula and the corrupted version Sandra had been preparing to sell him. Waverly said nothing through the first 3 pages. By the 4th, his hands had closed into fists on his knees. She was going to sell me a broken formula, he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was completely flat. A non-functional compound, dressed up in my legitimate research. I kept my voice measured, even though my chest had gone tight again. Your money would have transferred. The compound would have failed in trials. And when investors demanded answers, the trail would have led directly back to Foster Biosciences, to me as the source of the fraud. I paused. She wasn't just stealing from you, Mr. Waverly. She was using you as the final mechanism to destroy everything I've built. Waverly stood up abruptly and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to me, one hand pressed against the glass, looking out at the Boston skyline beginning to blur with dusk. His shoulders were rigid. I could see his reflection, the tight set of his mouth, the controlled fury working through him like a current. I did 6 months of due diligence on this deal, he said, his voice rough at the edges. 6 months. She is extremely good at what she does, I said. She spent 8 years inside my life and I didn't see it clearly until 3 weeks ago. He turned around. His eyes were hard and bright the way a man's eyes get when he's furious, and is deciding exactly how to direct that fury. What do you need from me? Something in my chest loosened just slightly. I hadn't been certain until that moment which way he would go. A man with $80 million at stake could rationalize almost anything. But Thomas Waverly was looking at me like a man who'd just discovered he'd been used as a weapon, and that was a feeling nobody forgave. I need your testimony, I said. A signed declaration describing every communication you had with Sandra Voss, the meetings, the documents she presented, the wire transfer instructions she provided. The FBI has an open investigation. Your cooperation will be essential to the criminal case. Done. No hesitation. He walked back to the armchair and sat down with the decisive weight of a decision already made. What else? The November 15th closing, I need you to delay it. String it along if you have to. We need her to believe the deal is still active through the public launch of the compound in mid-November. Waverly's eyes narrowed. You want her there. I want her to walk into that room believing she still has something to win. I leaned forward. And then I want to take it away from her in front of every scientist, every investor, and every journalist in that building. For a long moment, Waverly studied me with something that looked almost like respect. Then the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of a strategy. You've been planning this for weeks. Since March 15th, I said. The day I found out who she really was. He reached into his jacket, produced a business card, and slid it across the table toward me. My personal attorney's number. Have your people call by morning. We'll have the declaration signed by noon. Then he paused. Dr. Foster, one more thing. Yes, the real formula. His voice was careful now, precise. The actual compound B synthesis. Is it secure? Filed under USPTO Track 1 on March 20th, I said. Emergency Patent Provisional Protection active. The real data is encrypted and distributed across 3 independent servers, none of which Sandra has ever had access to. I met his gaze. What she stole was a copy I had seeded specifically for her. It was modified before she took it. Waverly stared at me for a beat. Then he let out a short, sharp exhale, not quite a laugh, but the sound a person makes when they realize they underestimated someone. You knew she'd take it. I suspected, I said. I hoped I was wrong. He picked up his jacket and stood. You weren't. He offered his hand again. His grip was just as firm as the first time, but something in it had changed, a recognition maybe of shared purpose. I'll be at the November launch. I'll save you a seat in the front row, I said. After he left, I sat alone in the suite for a long time. The city lights spread out beyond the window, amber and white and cold, indifferent as always. My hands were finally fully still. Nathan was waiting for my call. Rebecca was waiting for my call. The FBI agent assigned to the case was waiting for my call. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Nathan's name. 7 months, I thought. 7 months until the launch. 7 months until she walks into that room thinking she's won. I pressed call. It's me, I said when Nathan picked up. Waverly's in, all of it. The sound my son made on the other end of the line. Half relief, half something that broke open like a wave I will remember for the rest of my life. Tuesday, April 8th, 2025 through Friday, November 14th, 2025. FBI Boston Field Office, Foster Biosciences, and the Fairmont Copley Plaza, Boston. The 7 months that followed were the longest of my life, and I have lived through a great many long stretches of time. I used to think that waiting for a compound to crystallize in a cold lab at 2 in the morning was the ultimate test of patience. I was wrong. Waiting for justice, real justice, the kind that moves through federal courts and grand jury proceedings and pretrial motions, that is an entirely different kind of endurance. It began the morning after the Langham. April 8th, 7:22 a.m. Rebecca and I walked into the FBI Boston Field Office on One Center Plaza together. The agent assigned to our case was a woman named Special Agent Diane Forsyth, calm, methodical, the kind of person who took notes in neat columns and never used 2 words when one would do. Dr. Foster, she said, shaking my hand across the conference table. We've been expecting this. You already knew. I couldn't keep the surprise out of my voice. We had a parallel inquiry running on Mercer Foster Holdings LLC since January. She opened a folder. Your filings accelerated our timeline considerably. Between your documentation, Dr. Webb's sworn affidavit, and Mr. Waverly's declaration, we have enough for an arrest warrant. My chest contracted sharply. Hearing it stated that plainly arrest warrant made something in me go cold and hot at the same time. 8 years. She had sat across from me at our kitchen table. She had handed me coffee every morning for 8 years, and now a federal agent was saying arrest warrant in a clean government building, and all I could do was press my palm flat against my thigh and breathe. When? Nathan asked from my left. His voice was tight controlled, but his knee was bouncing under the table the way it used to when he was 12 years old and waiting for something he was afraid of. We move when the moment is strategically optimal, Agent Forsyth said. We'd like her to take one more significant action before we close in. Something that adds a count. Rebecca leaned forward. She's going to try to liquidate assets. The offshore transfer on April 7th was the beginning. She'll move more. We're watching every account, Forsyth said. When she transfers again, we move. She transferred again on May 9th. 3 days later, on Monday, May 12th, 2025 at 6:15 in the morning, Sandra Voss was arrested at Logan Airport. Rebecca called me the moment she heard. They have her, William. Her voice cracked just once, just at the edge, and then she steadied herself. She was at the gate. Flight to Zurich. I sat down on the edge of my desk and pressed my free hand over my eyes. My throat closed. I didn't trust myself to say anything for a full 10 seconds. When I finally spoke, my voice came out rougher than I intended. Did she say anything? Apparently, Rebecca said, she told the arresting agent that she had done nothing wrong. A pause. Then she asked for her attorney. I exhaled a long, ragged breath that felt like it had been stored in my lungs for weeks. Of course she did. The months between May and November were a blur of depositions, motions, and evidence review. The federal charges were substantial: wire fraud, identity fraud, theft of trade secrets under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, fraudulent formation of a business entity, money laundering under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956. Sandra's attorney filed 3 motions to dismiss. All 3 were denied. The Board of Foster Biosciences, under Eleanor Holt's steady leadership, voted unanimously to authorize the November 14th public launch of Compound B, the real Compound B with its authentic synthesis parameters. Intact, its patent protection confirmed its clinical potential, fully documented. Nathan co-chaired the planning committee. Marcus agreed to speak. Thomas Waverly confirmed his attendance, and in a gesture I hadn't expected personally reached out to 3 other institutional investors who had been approached by Sandra under false pretenses. The evening before the launch, I stood in the lobby of the Fairmont Copley Plaza while the event team arranged chairs in the grand ballroom. Nathan was beside me reviewing his notes on a legal pad. The room smelled of fresh flowers and old wood and possibility. "Nervous?" Nathan asked without looking up. "Terrified," I said honestly. My hands were steady, but my heart was running hard, the specific, focused terror of a man who has survived something enormous and is about to stand in front of the world and prove it. Nathan looked up then. His eyes were bright, not with tears for once, but with something steadier. Pride, maybe. Or simply the recognition of how far we had come. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "Tell me. Mom used to say you were the kind of man who finished what he started." His voice roughened at the edges. She was right. My throat tightened until I couldn't speak. I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small, and I held on for a moment. He let me. That meant everything. "Let's finish this," I said. He nodded, squared his shoulders, and we walked into the ballroom together. Saturday, November 15th, 2025. Foster Biosciences, Basement Laboratory, Boston, 6:04 a.m. The night before had gone exactly as we planned, and nothing like I expected. I had rehearsed what I would say at the podium. I had reviewed the slides, confirmed the data, walked the stage twice with the audio team. I had prepared for everything except the moment Thomas Waverly stood up from the front row, mid-presentation, right as I reached the slide showing the corrupted formula side by side with the authentic one, and said in a voice that carried clearly to every journalist in that room, "I was the intended buyer of that fraudulent compound. I am here tonight as a witness, not an investor, and I want every person in this building to understand what was nearly done in Dr. Foster's name." The room had erupted. Press cameras flashed. Board members gripped their armrests. And somewhere in the back of the ballroom, standing near the exit with a glass of water she never drank, was a reporter from the Boston Globe who would spend the next 6 hours writing the story that would run on the front page by morning. I didn't sleep after the launch. I came home, sat in my kitchen, drank 2 cups of coffee that went cold, and watched the sun begin to lighten the windows. At 5:47 a.m., I picked up my coat and drove to the building. The security guard at the lobby desk, a young man named Owen, who had worked the overnight shift for 3 years, looked up in surprise. "Dr. Foster, it's Saturday." "I know, Owen." I managed to smile. Old habit. He buzzed me through without another word. The elevator was empty. The building was still. I took it down to the basement level, where the original lab sat behind a reinforced door that still required my fingerprint and a 6-digit code I had set myself 22 years ago. The lab smelled exactly as it always had. Ethanol and metal, and something faintly mineral, the accumulated scent of 22 years of work. The overhead fluorescents flickered once, then held steady. My benches were clean the way I always left them. The spectrometers were covered. The centrifuge was off. And on the far wall, the whiteboard I had been writing on since 1997, still covered in equations I hadn't erased because I couldn't bring myself to. I pulled a stool to the center of the room and sat down. My knees ached slightly, they always did in the cold, and I pressed my palms against them and simply let myself be in the room for a while. No agenda, no depositions, no board meetings, just me and the lab and the soft hum of the ventilation system that had never once been silent in 2 decades. I heard the door behind me beep, then footsteps, then Nathan's voice. "Owen called me." I turned. My son was standing in the doorway in a heavy coat, his hair slightly disheveled, a paper cup of coffee in each hand. His eyes were tired and warm and unbearably familiar. "You didn't have to come," I said. "I know." He crossed the room and handed me one of the cups. It was still hot. I wrapped both hands around it, and the warmth moved straight through my palms and into my chest. I wanted to. He pulled a second stool from under the bench and sat beside me, and for a moment we both just looked at the whiteboard together. The equations, the margin notes. The date I had written in the upper left corner on the day I first synthesized compound A in blue marker that had faded to gray September 12th, 2003. "Do you regret it?" Nathan asked. "Any of it. Marrying her. Not listening to me sooner." The question sat between us honestly, the way real questions do. I took a long sip of coffee. My throat worked around it. "I regret the time," I said finally. 8 years that's not nothing. That's a significant portion of whatever I have left. I looked at the whiteboard. But I don't regret what I built. She couldn't take that. She tried and she couldn't. I paused. And I don't regret that you never stopped watching out for me. Even when I didn't want you to. Nathan's jaw tightened. He dropped his head forward and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, the gesture he made when he was trying not to break. His shoulders shook once, just once. Then he looked up and his eyes were glassy and bright, and he said roughly, "I was so scared, Dad. The whole time. I was so scared she was going to win." "I know." I reached over and gripped his forearm with both hands. "She didn't." He nodded, blinking hard. Took a breath. Another. Then he turned back to the whiteboard and pointed at an equation in the lower right corner, the final synthesis step for compound B written in my handwriting from 2 years ago. "That's the one, right? The real one." "That's the one," I said. He stared at it for a long moment. "It looks almost simple." I let out a sound that surprised me, something between a laugh and a sob, rough at the edges, real, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be for months. 22 years, I said. That's what 22 years of not giving up looks like written on a whiteboard. Nathan laughed, then a full, genuine, watery laugh that bounced off the lab walls. He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist, not bothering to be subtle about it. Mom would have had something to say about that. She would have told me to clean the whiteboard, I said, and then she would have photographed it before I did. We both laughed at that. The sound filled the room, warm and ragged and very alive. Eventually, the laughing settled, and we sat together in the quiet. The good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting, and walked to the whiteboard. I uncapped a blue marker, a new one purchased last week, and in the upper right corner, beside a margin I had always left blank, I wrote the date, November 15th, 2025, and underneath it, 4 words I had been waiting, 22 years, 8 of which were stolen to write, Compound B, patent confirmed. Nathan stood behind me and read it. He put his hand on my shoulder, firm, steady, the grip of a man who had learned that holding on matters. What happens now? He asked. I capped the marker, set it down on the tray. Looked at the equation, the date, the 4 words, and the 22 years of work surrounding them on every side. Now, I said, we build something worth protecting. I've been sitting in this lab for a long time now, longer than I probably should. But I needed to finish this, not just for the case, not just for the company, but for myself. You know, I used to believe that I was a careful man, a precise man, the kind of man who measured everything twice before he committed. And yet I let someone sleep beside me for 8 years without truly knowing her name. That tells you something about how blindness works. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as love, disguised as trust, disguised as the life you always wanted. If there is one thing I would tell you, one thing I wish someone had told me, it is this: don't be like me. Don't wait for the proof to be so overwhelming that you can no longer deny it. When the people who love you raise their voices in warning, stop. Listen. Pride is an expensive thing to protect. I am not a religious man by nature, but I have found myself grateful lately, genuinely, quietly grateful. I believe God gave me just enough time to see clearly before it was too late. That is not luck. That is grace. These are my stories, a father's stories. And if even one of them stays with you, makes you hold your family a little tighter, trust a little more wisely, then every word was worth writing. This has been a Grandpa Stories, a family story told the only way I know how, honestly and without apology. If it moved you, if it made you think, I'd love to know what you took from it. Leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. More Grandpa Stories are coming, more family story moments that remind us what truly matters. One last thing, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. A final note before we go: some of the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for right now, no hard feelings. Step away and find what speaks to you. But if you're staying, welcome. The best Grandpa Stories, the most human family story of all, is always the one still being written.